Hello. We always tend to get caught out when we suddenly go live on Facebook. What tends to happen is that I have to rush off and do all my magic and try and link in with Facebook. And as we do so, it always tends to beat us to it. But we're getting better at this at the moment. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This is a show that I'm particularly interested in. I suppose I wouldn't be here if I wasn't, would I really? But effectively, today's guest is somebody whose work has fascinated me for an awful long time, and it's Dr. Leo Ruickbie. And Leo, if any of you guys read 14 Times, you will know that Leo did a fascinating interview with Mr. Bigelow, who is the guy that's putting up a wonderful amount of money for a series of essays and money for prizes for coming up with ideas and conclusions about evidence for life after death, or whether we survive our mortal coil when we move on. So that was a very, very fascinating interview, and we might touch upon that as well. But there's so many areas of overlap here with the work that Leo has been doing over the years that we've got a great amount of information to get through. And it's highly likely that probably we will try and invite Leo back to join us, probably for an Anthony Peake InCon, which normally lasts around about 2.5 hours, so we can get in deeper into a lot of the issues. But I'll just give you a little bit of background about Leo, which I'll be reading. So if I'm looking away and everything else, this is because what I'm doing. Okay. Leo Ruickbie, PhD, London, MA distinction, BA honours, and Associate of King's College London, is a visiting fellow in psychology at the University of Northampton and the author of 6 books. Most recently, Angels in the Trenches, Spiritualism, Superstition, and the Supernatural during the First World War, and is co-editor with Robert McLuhan of Is There Life After Death in preparation. Actively involved in the parapsychological research community, he is a council member of the Society for Psychical Research and a professional member of the Parapsychological Association, as well as being editor of the magazine of the Society for Psychical Research. He's also an elected member of the Royal Historical Society and a member of the Royal Photographic Society, and has been shortlisted for the 2021 Pink Lady Food Photographer of the Year. His website is ruickbie.com, which we'll place on there. Very, very quickly, Leo, though, before we get into the really big questions and everything else, photography. So what kind of themes do you do in your photography?
Yeah, that's something I've always been interested in, and I think with the magazine, it's something that I've been able to bring together with my research interests, because I wanted to make that a much more visual medium than it had been previously, and there was a lot of opportunity to do that there. And the problem was always getting the pictures that I wanted, so I ended up just taking more pictures to get those. And so that's actually been a really nice co-development with just taking my photographic work into a new direction. And part of that's being kind of documentary type work. So, going out and meeting mediums, shooting some photographs of Kai Muga, for example. The photograph that got me shortlisted, unfortunately, I didn't actually win anything, but I got a nice mention there. That was a photograph that was taken during a parapsychological conference in Vietnam. And that was a really fantastic event. And, I had my camera with me, took some photographs, and the picture that was included there was just it was a really nice end of conference kind of photograph. And we were all sitting around sharing a hot pot at a roadside cafe, and somebody was just plucking out some food with their chopsticks, and it was a kind of split second, but it really, for me, it was a special image, because it was the end of the conference. We were just sort of winding down. We were sharing this meal together, and so that's it's documenting and also capturing somehow the spirit of places, spirit of events, and meeting people and so on. So I think I've been very lucky that I've been able to develop that now with the magazine. So
I think you've done a wonderful job with the magazine, by the way, if I may say that. I mean, I really find I look forward to the magazine now. I've always enjoyed it anyway, but now it's more interesting, it's more dynamic, and it is more pertinent to people's ideas. And it comes as no surprise that photography interests you, because I noticed on your website you had an image, or it was on one of your book covers, that very much reminded me of is it the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall? you know, the old 1930s
yeah,
photograph.
yeah.
Which is intriguing. And of course, photography, in terms of the work we're interested in, is a very important medium for us in terms of if we're interested in proofs of survival after death, of ghosts, various other things as well. So it's of profound importance. But what was it that got you into the subject? What was it that twigged your interest in the esoteric and the magical and the occult?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I just want to ask myself, you think, well, why have I taken this path? And I think a lot of it's down to just growing up in Scotland, and it was very much an element within living culture, as it were. You know, things like Halloween and so on. We still practice a kind of traditional folkloric type Halloween. Ghosts were very much part of the common folklore. So these things were they were discussed, and they were seen as normal and part of our culture. And you know, a lot of people just didn't tune into that, weren't interested or whatever. But it's something that stayed with me and really caught my interest. And it's just been great to find ways in which I can explore these things in a way that hopefully other people also find useful. You know, so starting with the PhD at King's College, and looking into modern witchcraft and magic and so on. That was just a super experience. I mean, it was hellish hard work, but it was just so lucky to be able to do that. And at the time, it was also quite coincidental, because a lot of research had been kind of pushed back or shifted into different channels, because looking at things like witchcraft and paganism and magic wasn't really seen as sort of proper research. So I also just sort of hit it at the right time, that this was just starting to be looked at properly. And it's been great to be able to take that kind of, you know, scholarly lens and look at these things, whilst really just following something that you're always interested in. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, what's your favorite color? And my favorite color happens to be sort of like ghosts and magic. Do you know what I mean? And this, I've just found a way in which I've been able to make that my career. So it's been a great ride, actually.
It must be absolutely wonderful to have the opportunity to do that, because when I was at university in the the early to mid 1970s, I did a degree at sociology and history at Warwick, and I did have the opportunity there to have some courses that were quite interesting, such as Renaissance art and the kind of the esoteric traditions within Renaissance art, but also the sociology of religion and the sociology of belief and everything else as well. And when I came across your work, this was something that really, I thought, wow, this is so wonderful. It's somebody that's applying a sociological analysis of unusual phenomenon, you know, and the question of not what the experience is, but what the experience tells us about society in many ways, you know. And I know your work on witchcraft and Wicca is absolutely fascinating in that area. And really, it's so important. And I think there is, as you say, there's a changing element now that academia is now starting to approach these things in a far more healthy approach, and saying it tells us something about society and how society is functioning. But in terms of your general themes of your work over the years, I mean, what themes would you say? What were the areas that have really interested you? And what are the things that have astounded you, I suppose, in having the opportunity to research it as an academic?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I think my kind of overarching theme is really this idea of reenchantment. So, you know, going back to Max Weber and disenchantment, and seeing this sort of iron cage of rationalism that's trapped the modern world. And that always struck me as a bit too final. And so I began by looking at taking modern witches and really using them to kind of test the hypothesis of disenchantment. Could there be reenchantment? Here we have a group of people who, from the outside, would meet that definition. So that was my kind of beginning. And I've gone on from that, from looking at sort of magic, to really go into the kind of psychical phenomena, psi phenomena, and so on, and think, well, you know, this is also related to the idea of magic. So that some of these things that you know, people would be testing in a laboratory in a very cold and calculating way would have been seen as witchcraft and magic in prior times. So it's just relating it all underneath this kind of reenchantment hat. And more broadly, I might think of it, as maybe half seriously as a sort of parasociology, because as you said previously, it's to look at this particular aspect of human experience and take it seriously and see how it's affected us. Because of course, the sociology is basically founded on the study of religion. And what is religion if it's not about the paranormal? Almost every religion, it's about the kind of founder figure's paranormal experience, which he then communicates to his followers. And that's the kind of bedrock experience. And I don't think there's these differences that we put in our subjects between studying religion, studying what we would call the paranormal, what we would call magic, and the kind of fighting you get between these disciplines, so that one is seen as superstition, whereas one can be seen as belief, and these sorts of things. And I don't think they're at all helpful. And hopefully we're moving beyond those sorts of arguments and can really look at this whole spectrum of ideas relating to another world and how they do affect us. And it's particularly useful to take a sociological point of view and kind of step back from this kind of, is it true, is it false, are they charlatans, are they really in touch with the dead, or whatever it might be. Because even if somebody is a fraudulent medium, it's still interesting to find out how that works and what it means for people, as much as if they're a real medium. I mean, the consequences of those things are different in different ways, but sociologically speaking, they're still important, they're still interesting. And so I have these new kind of debates and arguments, because now that I've moved more away from the sort of witchcraft and magic research and more into the kind of psychical research and looking at parapsychology and so on. And a lot of people that you deal with there, they're either for or against. You get believers and you get the hardline skeptics, and there's this great battle going on between them. And for me, that's another layer of, that's also interesting sociologically, to see people take it so seriously, to fight over it so viciously. So there are lots of different layers to what's going on, but this would be a kind of half-joking sort of parasociology, and then within that, my own idea of what reenchantment could mean, and taking it on from what it would logically be implied from Max Weber's work. And I think he was far too negative, and I think a lot of his own personal psychology came out in his description of disenchantment. And I think there are plenty of ways in which we can find things that can enchant us and re-enchant us today. And part of that is to also think, I very often stop and think, what good is any of this to anyone? Why should I do it? Am I just following some kind of intellectual curiosity for my own vanity? And sometimes yes. And that's when I have to bring myself back to think, what good is it for anyone? And apply that to my subject and apply that to myself. And I think that looking at something like reenchantment is about ways of finding reconnection with deeper meanings, with greater satisfaction and so on in people's lives. And I think there you can find useful models that can help people, especially now as we're entering more and more this virtual world, which is, it can be quite terrifying in many respects, that we do need a more grounded sense of what is important to us, what does it mean to really be a human being, and so on. And hopefully that can come through with what I'm doing as much as anything else. I hope so. But
well, it's profoundly important, isn't it? It's understanding exactly what is taking place when somebody has an unusual experience, when they experience an hallucination, or when a group of people experience an hallucination, like say the incident at Fatima, with the sun spinning in the sky. These seem to be collective sociological phenomena, but are intensely personal as well. And in this case, I'm reminded of the work of people like Emil Durkheim and his work on suicide. The most personal thing you could ever do is commit suicide. And yet Durkheim proved that, there can be altruistic suicide, there can be anomic suicide, there can be various ways that people will take very intensely personal things, but they extrapolate outwards into society. And I think very much, if you start looking at the history of spiritualism, and you look at the way in which spiritualism started after the Fox sisters and everything else as well, there seems to be, the belief itself seems to manifest itself collectively within people's subconscious in some way. And people seem to see these things. I mean, it's a term I've been using in my writings recently, the egregorial, the idea that there's a kind of a feedback mechanism taking place here. There's the expectations of what people are expecting to see. And as you rightly say, we're in a position now that people like you and I and the people that are in my little groups, we're probably not popular with either groups, because we're taking a very objective viewpoint, but at the same token saying that the phenomenon is real. It's the question of what we mean define by real in this way, isn't it? You know, and these are hugely fascinating things. So when you first started writing about these things, I mean, what was your very first book? What was the book that you thought, this is the one I want to write? And what was it about?
Yeah, that was Witchcraft Out of the Shadows. And that was the motivation was to take my PhD research and contextualize it and write it in a way that basically anybody could read and get something out of. Because as you know, that this whole sort of ivory tower idea that the information can just sort of languish within academia, that academics themselves only end up talking to each other about these things. And it was really to try and think, well, how can I get this out to a wider audience? Because, I think I found something really interesting in relation to modern witchcraft. But it was also then to think, okay, well, let's think about witchcraft in general. What does it mean? How is it formed? And then to see how that relates to modern witchcraft. So that was the whole book, contextualize the PhD and write it in a more popular way. So that was a lot of fun, actually. That was a nice book to put together. And
when were you writing that? What period were you writing
that? So that came out in 2004. So I've just had the 15th anniversary edition has come out in 2019. So I mean, there's already quite some water has gone under the bridge since that one. Yeah.
Well, it would be fascinating, wouldn't you? Those people like Alex Saunders and individuals like that in the 1960s. And of course, the Wicca Man seemed to bring up this whole thing of the modern idea of Wicca. So did you went out, you interviewed people? I mean, it's probably quite enclosed circles. It must have been quite interesting going in as an academic into what are fairly esoteric groups. How did you find that? Were they acceptable? How did you find that?
Yeah, it was okay, actually. Of course, you're always, somewhat anxious because, of course, a lot depends on your access to these groups in terms of what you're going to be able to produce afterwards. And there had been an academic who had completed a PhD not long before me and had ruffled quite a lot of feathers. So that was interesting, but rather than sort of keep me out because of that, people tended to discuss that with me quite a lot. So that was also a very interesting aspect to it. But yeah, my research involved a lot of participant observation. So really getting out there and doing it to see what it was and taking part in rituals and so on. And then from there, I developed a questionnaire and delivered that over telephone. And again, that had so many amazing conversations with people, going through my questionnaire and everything. It was quite a neat little questionnaire, and then you go through it, and people have such amazing stories that you can't really fit it all in. So it was, that was just so interesting, and a lot came out around the sort of areas that I was trying to focus on. That made me think that there's a lot more to really explore in terms of people's relationship with this kind of other world, because witches, magicians, that's what they're trying to contact and work with, and that's very similar to going into more kind of commonly known areas like spiritualism and so on, operating in the same sort of fields.
Yes, because I noticed one of the areas that you've written on is the role of nudity in witchcraft and everything else as well, which I thought was a fascinating area. There was straight images from the Wicker Man coming into my mind straight away when I read that. But these are important areas, aren't they? Because witches are, you know, people who we interface with all the time. They're people that live within society and have very normal lives outside of this. So there's this very interesting dichotomy, isn't there, between the world they live within in their witchcraft. And did you find that? Because I always find whenever I've dealt with esoteric groups, it's the normality I find extraordinary and the sudden change. I did some work with the Servants of the Light a few years ago. And the way in which there was a massive difference between incredibly radically normal people and then becoming quite different in the way they see the world. There's almost holding two completely different worldviews at the same time, which is so counter to our materialist reductionist model. So have you got any interesting stories or background to when you were doing that research that you thought at the time, this is really fascinating, this has really intrigued me?
Well, as you mentioned it, maybe I should explain a bit more about the whole kind of nudity aspect of sort of the research that I've done on that. A few talks and a chapter in a book, Visions of Enchantment, because this idea of, it was a way to encapsulate the whole idea of witchcraft itself within one particular image as a shorthand for people to grasp what it meant. Because the construction of the idea of witchcraft, say from the 16th century onwards, was basically this whole thing about inversion on a number of different scales, to look at the kind of the world of God and the world of Satan. So everything was kind of reversed to reflect that difference. And so nudity, of course, played this particular part that it created this instant contrast between the everyday world and a world that shouldn't really be seen in this sort of public spectacle, and whole other layers of meaning on top of that. But it was this kind of shorthand to work with there. But I think people watching this will be relieved to know that most witches today don't practice nude. It's it could be something to do with the British climate. But
one of the things, again, when I saw the movie Wicker Man, in fact, my sister was so taken by that movie. Her daughter is called Rowan. And of course, Rowan was the little girl that had disappeared on the island. And Summer Isles, it's somewhere in Scotland, but there seems to be this idyllic place that probably was somewhere in the center of the Gulf Stream or something, because it seemed so equably climatized, so people could wander around naked and do all these wonderful things. Sarah, have you any comments at the moment? I always like to bring you in at some stage and your pertinent observations on these things.
I was really interested in what you were talking about, Leo, with regard to this idea of reenchantment. And I think you're really right that what makes this kind of work important is how it can be applied to our modern lives in some ways. And I think that within religion and within those beliefs of the other world, you increase the magic in everyday life, and that adds value to people's lives and can do at any time. So I think about that in terms of our relationship to nature, and a lot of obviously ancient religions and paganism and witchcraft are about nature and our connection to nature spirits and natural forces. So is that something that you are hoping to kind of propagate in the modern world?
Oh, that's a nice idea, actually. Maybe I should. I hadn't really been thinking along those lines. But I think so. I mean, just personally, I love going out in nature, and I always thought of it as my kind of green therapy. And recently there has been a bit of research picking up on the psychological benefits of being in nature, and people, have found that it's got positive outcomes for people. So there's definitely a benefit there. There's more than just kind of relaxation or whatever. It is good for people to get out into nature. But I think coming from my work specifically on magic and witchcraft and so on, the things that were beneficial to people was actually the practice of magic. And it didn't have to go so far as to say that, magic worked. Although what I often say is that magic works, but not in the way we think it does. So that, people did find the practice of magic to improve their lives in terms of things like well-being and so on. But that was not necessarily a direct result of a spell for well-being or something like that. So it was just the practice itself. It seemed to give people control over what was happening, particularly in areas where control is not possible. And there were lots of aspects to that. I mean, of course, there were some cases in which people did claim that magic had worked, or they had had particular kind of spiritual visions and encounters, encounters, which were really fascinating to hear about. But from my research, it was basically to look at how the practice of magic itself had been beneficial to people. And I think that's what I would want to take from my work there to kind of bring to a wider audience, as it were.
And do you think that stems then from that sense of agency? Like you say, most people probably feel pretty helpless, and often people feel like they're a victim of their environment, and magic is that empowering force that gives them a sense of control and superstition, or that magical belief system helps people believe in miracles. Because I suppose a lot of the ancient religious ideas come from this idea of miracles being provided by supernatural powers or entities. So even if they never happen, that faith that you have in them gives you confidence and makes your life feel better.
Yeah, interestingly, not most, but the largest group of, to categorize what witches use magic for, it was mostly for healing of other people. And also for personal development. So together, this kind of idea of changing things for the better, whether themselves or other people, was really about over 50% of what magic was used for. The more typical things like sort of personal advantage to get something, win the lottery or whatever it might be, that was really quite a small part of what witches did magic for. So they were using it for, primarily healing. And it was interesting that this use of magic to direct it towards the benefit of other people had this effect of giving them a better feeling of quality of life and personal development. So it was an interesting consequence of what they were doing that was unintended but beneficial.
So the conjuring up feelings of empathy and benevolence is really what has improved their life then, perhaps.
Yes, it could be. I mean, we connect that with these ideas that you get in sort of more popular kind of psychology of thankfulness and so on, and gratitude. These ideas have been quite popular recently to express these sorts of things, and maybe that also fits in with what the witches are doing now.
Well, this is where it moves on, doesn't it? Quite interestingly, to the area that you referenced earlier on with the work you did, or associated work with mediumship and people like Kai Mugi, because we recently had Stephen Browday on the show and we were discussing about his work with Kai. So we could move on now to mediumship and your experiences of that, because that's a fascinating area, isn't it? From a sociological point of view, it is something that is very, very intriguing.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Kai, I was really fortunate there to get the opportunity to go and take part in, a physical mediumship circle, because of course, most people who are researching this subject can only look at these historical accounts and so on, and not really get any first-hand experience of what it must have been like to sit in. And again, it's a situation in which I'm not playing any kind of for or against arguments, but I just want to sort of see what it is and how it affects people taking part in it. And that's been a really interesting thing, because I've been able to compare my own kind of personal reactions with those of people who've taken part in the seances, and seen they've been quite different. And that's an interesting sort of corrective to your own kind of academic standpoint. You see how it can affect people. So with Kai, I mean, again, that was something that got me into a lot of hot water, actually, because with the magazine, I published some pretty critical discussions of his mediumship, and got to know a lot of the researchers involved in that, which was great. And I think a lot of people had also felt kind of let down by the situation. Well, there was a lot of emotions anyway. But having printed this, and I thought, well, what's Kai got to say? And I thought it's only fair to really present his side of the story. And fortunately, he doesn't live too far away. He lives in a place just on the other side of Frankfurt. So I was able to go up and visit him, and got a roasting from from him about publishing all these critical articles. But I said, it's not me that's saying that, and here I am to give you a voice of reply to these criticisms. So that was great. Once I kind of got out of the crossfire and was able to just get involved with the experiences there, that was really good. The first seance we did was with a small group and really just looking in a kind of total darkness environment, and there were apparent indications of table levitation and sounds and lights and so on going on. And then the second seance was a kind of materialization one. It was a larger group of people, and we had some light in the situation, and he apparently produced ectoplasm during that. So these were just great situations to be part of and see, how do seances work? What's it like to actually be in them? Because I think with the total darkness, the first thing that really strikes you is how quickly you become disorientated. And this gives you an insight into how, the mind can start to work in different ways. You become disorientated. We know that conditions of darkness can lead to hallucination and so on. You have the classic prisoner's cinema, for example, when a prisoner's locked up in solitary confinement in total darkness and they start hallucinating images. So you had conditions which would really kind of encourage hallucination. You had the disorientation of the darkness, and also things like loud music, and you had to sing along with the music as well to kind of you take part in it. So there were lots of elements to it, and to see how that would function, you've really got to get that chance to be part of that and feel what the conditions are like. Because looking at all these historical cases, and people will describe using this and that control, but there'll be periods of darkness or whatever. It's very difficult to read these just pure literary descriptions and not get any kind of underlying sense unless you've been there and you've seen what it's like to be in this total darkness and have apparently paranormal things going on around you with other people who are also kind of being amazed by it. So that you've got these social aspects going on in which you're kind of encouraged to believe and take part. So that's been just wildly beneficial to have that opportunity to get in there. And I think it also produced some really interesting issues of the magazine, because we had this big fight going on in print between the two sides of the debate. And I like this sort of controversy. I find that it's also interesting. It's just unfortunate that I got kind of caught in the crossfire and somehow blamed by both sides for representing the different opinions. So that wasn't so pleasant. But the rest of it, this is what I love about the magazine, is it's given me also the opportunity to get involved in so many things and talk to so many people. Because very often, you'll read somebody's book, but you don't really have a particularly strong reason to get in touch with them. But when you're the editor of the magazine, you can easily get in touch with them and say, why don't you write a piece for me or do an interview or something? And it's been a great networking opportunity, which, invaluable, absolutely.
Well, that's it, isn't it? The opportunity to really speak to people and get to know them. It's one of the things that I found doing this show. It's really, I'll read somebody's book and then I'll get to know them. And to use a sociological term as well, or a historical term, you understand the bees in their bonnet, as E.H. Carr said. And in many ways, I feel I'm very similar to you. I spent some time doing a scientists and mediums event at the Arthur Findlay College in Essex, in Stansted Mount Fitchett. And myself and a friend of mine, Dr. Alan Roberts, were invited to go along to this. And it was fascinating watching, particularly the physical mediumship that was taking place and what people collectively thought they saw rather than what we saw. because we didn't see anything, but other people clearly not only saw things, but were reacting to the things as well. And I know from, we had a fascinating discussion last week with Nick Kyle of the Scottish Society for Psychical Research about Skull. And again, you know, the similarities between how Skull worked, you know, in semi-darkness in the red light, to the way Kai works, which is going straight back, isn't it, you know, to the classical cases, Imperator and Rector and everything else as well. It seems to be a similar thing. And I think it was fascinating you saying that, because I'd never thought about that before. It's almost like being an anthropologist and actually becoming part of the indigenous culture that you're looking at, because you're within the culture and seeing the world how the culture sees it. And I think you know, people like ourselves, again, we get fired at from both sides, because we're not saying it's true, we're not saying it's false, we're saying there's something far more interesting to tell us about human psychology and human collective psychology here. And indeed, in terms of that, you know, one of the things that must be the case all the time for you is people are always asking you, what are the questions that you are most asked? Because I imagine when you go to a dinner party, what do you do for a living, you know, and you'll say, well, this is what I do, and people will go, wow, tell me more, and they will be giving you their experiences and everything. So what have you found over the years that you found the most intriguing in terms of that?
Well, yeah, this kind of question and the dinner party conversations, yeah, because I've got a funny story in connection with that, because many years ago in Scotland, I was just staying, I think it was during the holidays and the term holidays, I was staying with my parents, and it turned out that it was the birthday of their neighbor, and so we went over, we had a kind of garden party, and you know, exactly that question came up, and I just explained in a very matter-of-fact way that I'm doing PhD and looking at modern witchcraft and so on, and you know, I didn't make it very elaborate, and I thought I explained it in quite a sort of down-to-earth way, but the next year, and I wasn't actually there, but of course my parents went over again, birthday party, garden party, they're all out there, and somebody was talking to my mother, and at one point in the conversation, they said, oh, you better be careful what you say, because a wizard lives next door. So, so I'd gone from, in the space of a year, I'd gone from just, you know, quietly telling somebody what I was doing as PhD research to actually becoming a wizard. And I think that also tells you something about rumors and how these things can develop. But yes, it is quite difficult to tell people what you're doing without it becoming sensational. And when I was doing more sort of witchcraft research, people were always asking, well, you know, are you a witch? And the point, that was never the point. I was always quite surprised by that question, because of course, you know, you're studying the subject in the same way that a zoologist might study a lion, but they don't become the lion. And so, you know, it was always a bit taken aback, and I was thinking, well, I'm just, you know, trying to do it scientifically. And then today, looking more into these sorts of things like the mediumship or whatever, people more, they'll ask, do you believe in it? And, you know, again, for me, that's not really the important question. It's kind of, the important question is, what does it mean? And, you know, this relates to not just my own belief or disbelief, but anybody else's belief, and how this all relates to each other. Sorry about that.
It's all right. It's obviously the spirits trying to get through to their wizard, I would imagine.
Couldn't it? Yeah, I can't seem to switch the phone off.
Physical mediumship. That's what happens. Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier was that you about the photography, and you'd done an event in Vietnam on a parapsychology event. That's very intriguing, because Vietnam is not necessarily a place I would necessarily associate with these kind of things, and I'm really intrigued by that. So what was the background to that?
Sorry, somebody's leaving a message, and I'm trying to. I've got my jumper on top of the phone, and I can't seem to switch.
You're trying to suffocate the phone. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's the archons, Leo. It's the archons. They do this all the time. Phenomena. Yeah, it's EVP. It's EVP. Definitely, it is.
I think it was. Yeah. Yeah, so what was the question?
The question was about Vietnam and the event you did there, the parapsychological conference that you were involved in Vietnam.
Yeah,
I've got visions. I've got visions of you here because I only a couple of days ago watched Apocalypse Now again, and I've just got visions of you wandering around along because I did the Mekong a few years ago, and it's a strange place, Vietnam. It's an interesting place, isn't it?
It's a lovely country, actually. The people were amazing. We were up north in Halong, so that's where we spent our time. And I had a
location.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was an absolutely brilliant location, and the organizer had selected that as a particular place for us to meet. But yeah, outside the hotel, there was a monument to an aircraft battery that had shot down the first American plane and so on. So this kind of, it was still within living memory of the people there. But I didn't encounter any hostility or anything from people. I mean, quite the opposite. They were very welcoming, very charming and polite. So I really had an excellent experience there. The thing about the conference itself was that it was an amazing combination between what we think of as a conference, a kind of academic conference with people getting up and talking, and a kind of, it was called a Sixth Sense Mind Competition as well. So it was also a kind of psychical event in itself. And
this sounds intriguing. You've got to tell us more about this.
Yeah, it was quite mad because we were, I think all of us coming over for the conference aspect didn't really know what to expect with the other half of the event, and we knew the organizer. His name's Bingo Wu, and he's presented a couple of times to the SPR because he's doing work with blind children in China to develop their kind of psychic abilities so that they can see with apparent success, which of course is quite an interesting thing. So we were all very interested to find out, what his particular techniques were, what he's really saying his success, how he measures that, and so on. And this gave us the opportunity to go and get to know him a bit better and see more deeply into his work with children. He didn't have blind children with him, but he did have groups of children that he was working with on a more commercial level to develop their abilities, and particularly to train them to be better academically at school and so on. And they were doing a whole range of really interesting things. They were kind of blindfolded, and he'd actually presented at the SPR, and he'd gotten some feedback about the blindfolds he'd used previously, and they were just simple eye coverings. And people had said, well, you should really go for a more complicated double covering effect and so on. And then he'd gone out and he'd either bought or had these made. So he had a kind of classic, eye covering here, and then there was also a fold that could come over to really screen as much as possible any possibility of vision, not just direct vision, but also to try and screen out any peripheral vision. I don't think it was entirely successful. I did catch one child with a card. They were trying to guess, kind of slipping it underneath the blindfold a little bit. But otherwise, that was fascinating to see, kind of Psi in the wild, as it were, what people were trying to do with these so-called abilities and to train them and all the rest of it. And he also had a number of people from China who were presenting on different aspects, mostly of sort of traditional things like, had people with Qigong practitioners and so on. So there were a whole range of different people with different levels. And there was one guy who just looked amazing. He was wearing sort of traditional costume and had all these kind of magical powers that he claimed. And we went through a few little things with him, which was quite interesting. I don't know if you saw it, but I wrote this up for the magazine of the SPR. So there's a nice feature in there with some photographs of him doing his magic, and one of them involved making people look younger. So he's in quite a lot of demand in China for sort of beautifying powers. And Yeah, so he actually did that on one of the participants, and this was one of the kind of people from the West who'd come over, and he tried to encourage us to think that her face had changed, but he then said he only did it on one half of her face, which was. I don't know if that was so that we could get an instant comparison between the
before and after.
Yeah. So there was stuff like that, and again, that's just fascinating to have at what could easily be quite a sort of stuffy conference or whatever. So that we had really immersed in different cultures and traditions and what people were doing and claiming to be able to do, and again, it's just absolutely fascinating experience, and to have that opportunity was just great.
Well, I suppose as well in Indochina, with the shamanic traditions, that probably like the Montagnards, there's going to be some quite interesting dynamics there, and I think that probably that's one of the areas I am told by my publishers and various other people that the area of moving into in terms of psychic phenomena, everything is very much South Asia and East Asia, because people are so fascinated by this, because of course they have the magical traditions as well. And it was interesting though that you mentioned again about the magazine, because just to wax lyrical again about how you've revolutionized that in so many ways. How did you end up becoming the editor of that? Because because that's where I first came across your work.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind comments about the magazine. I'm really happy to hear that you enjoy it. In terms of how did I end up with the job? Well, they advertised for it and I applied, so it was relatively straightforward. And my interview was quite amusing actually, because I was in the UK for a conference, and it's Bernard Carr, who's past president of the society and everything, wanted to interview me, and he phoned here to the house in Germany and spoke to my parents who were babysitting for us, and was just intending to do a telephone interview. And then he found out I was actually in Cambridge for this conference, so he tracked me down, and it was during one of the breaks. I was just standing about chatting, to the fellow delegates about witchcraft and whatnot, and Bernard popped up and said, "Oh, you, Leo, I want to interview you." And so we found ourselves an empty room, and I had the interview there. So it was a nice way to be interviewed. And one of Bernard's concerns was that I might bring too much witchcraft into the magazine, so I had to assure him that I would keep it under control.
Well, no Harry Potter. And
I don't think we've actually covered witchcraft or magic or anything like that yet. Covered a talk somebody gave about magic, but haven't actually discussed that. So yeah, I've been behaving.
I like the idea of Bernard appearing. When in my life, Bernard Carr seems to pop up in the most extraordinary places. I think there's more than one of him. I think he's cloned somewhere along the lines. But a wonderful guy, really, absolutely. So again, one of the things Sarah and I both find is that it's extraordinary because we're now doing the in-cons where we've got 2.5 hours to just really go into ideas. The Outspeak Consciousness Hour seems to go past so quickly. It's quite frightening, and we never really can cram everything in at all. It's one of those things. Really, we're probably going to try to make it some kind of mirrors within mirrors or something else. I don't know. But just very quickly, what are you working on now? What are the bees in your bonnet at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you know what I'm working on now.
I do indeed.
Yeah, it's a book on is there life after death, and this is an edited academic volume, and it goes back to about 2019 when I had discussions with Robert McLuhan and some other people at the SPR about this project, and we got it going in last year, and got such an amazing response to the call for papers for what was then just going to be one book, that decided to do it as a 2-volume set. So the first book is really looking at kind of broader range of theories and sort of more meta-analyses and so on, and ranging a bit more widely over it. And the second book is going to drill down to specific case studies and really make it maybe a bit more concrete for people. And I think together this will be quite a nice complement. So that's really the main thrust of what I'm working on, bringing this together. It's been really interesting again to see all the different ideas and approaches people are coming up with to this subject, and again meeting some kind of lines of resistance as opposed to what some people will consider appropriate. So I did include things like EVP and ITC, and I'm not terribly convinced by this subject myself, but I thought, well, it is a research area, we should include it if at all possible. But other people didn't really want. Well, there was one person who didn't want to take part in the project because of that, and I was a bit surprised to come across that. So again, there are lots of strange lines in the sand that you come across when doing a project like this. But I think taken together, we've got an amazing group of people, yourself included, all presenting really exceptional work on the subject, and I hope this is going to benefit from the huge amount of publicity that Robert Bigelow's generated for his project, because there's an extent to which they are in competition with each other, but I think this is going to be a useful competition that hopefully is just going to raise the awareness in the general public. We've had on Netflix the Surviving Death documentary, so there is a growing wider public interest in this subject, and I hope that we can bring the book to that market and not just make it an academic book, but really make it a book that's going to appeal to everyone and give them so much more information, because very often we're just getting little bits. We're getting near-death experiences, or we're getting reincarnation or whatever. But to bring all these things together within this volume and say, look, this is the whole picture. All of these different things are really giving us clues about the nature of the world and what might lie beyond what we understand as the world. So I think it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to seeing that come out.
It's a profoundly important exercise, and I'm delighted to have been involved in it, because I think it is so important. Yet again, moving towards more rigorous academic analysis, very much in keeping with the original founding members of the SPR. The idea of being as objective as you possibly can, and citing the statement by Marcelo Trui, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And this is exactly what you're attempting to do in your Is There Life After Death? So I was delighted to see that, a second volume was coming out, because this is profoundly important work. And I think more and more people are being drawn into this. And I think what we're trying to do, people like myself and like yourself, is to try and say, look, let's be more objective about this. There is something fascinating going on here, and it is very important that it is part of the human experience. You can't ignore it just because it doesn't fit in with the present materialist reductionist paradigm, because these extraordinary experiences do take place, and what is the link with that, with consciousness and everything else as well. Sarah, have you got any final points yourself that you'd like to make?
There was one thing that I did think about. It's a little bit off topic, I suppose, but I was wondering if you came across Shaktipat Kundalini activation at all. And I was wondering about that with regard to, I guess, the psychology of the participants. I read an article about a reporter going to one of these Shaktipat ceremonies and being like, nothing happened to me, which I kind of assume is because they weren't kind of sold or bought into the system. But I've met plenty of people that have experienced Kundalini activation, and it's been a mind-blowing experience for them. And you see videos of people going crazy and writhing all over the place. So I wondered if you'd come across that at all.
Well, unfortunately not. No.
Well, that sounds very intriguing, Sarah. We're going to have to have a show on this. It sounds like charismatic Christianity in many ways, doesn't it?
It reminded me what you were saying about the seances, and how some people are seeing things in a bit like watching a movie. You have to choose to suspend your disbelief in some ways. At least you have to buy into the narrative of it, and those things can be effective because of that. And if there isn't a relationship between the observer and the observed, the phenomena doesn't occur. So So I found that really interesting, and it really reminded me of the Kundalini activation rituals.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's this kind of sheep goat effect in which, believers get results and skeptics don't. Yeah, there's definitely a relationship between the two. There's no real pure observation. You're always involved in the experiment at whatever level, even if you don't think you are. So yeah, that's a good example of that.
Because it's the same even within physics, particularly within quantum physics, the discoveries that people will anticipate a subatomic particle like a muon and bang, it's there, so clearly that this relationship, this moving forward, this what I keep calling the egregorial, I think is a way forward of trying to understand these phenomena. Right, again, time has run away with us, as Einstein said. Time is it's an illusion, but it's a very, very persistent one. We always seem to run out of time. We never seem to have enough time on these shows. So very quickly, if you can tell us a little bit about how people can contact you, your fantastic website, by the way. Your website is absolutely superb. I wish, no, I shouldn't say that about my website, but yours really works incredibly well. So if anybody how can people contact you or get in touch with you? Or indeed, if anybody's interested in contributing chapters to the new book?
Yes, absolutely. The website is just my name. Unfortunately, my name's quite difficult to spell. But my email address is just my name again. It's just leo@ruickbie.com. So if you can find ruickbie.com, then you can get me at Leo. I've also got a companion website for the Angels in the Trenches book, and that's just angelsinthetrenches.com. I think you can also find me on the SPR website. You can find me on the Parapsychological Association websites, lots of different places where you'll be able to just type in my name, you'll find some way of approaching me. So yeah, I would love to hear from people if they've been watching this and they've got any questions. And as you say, if anybody wants to contribute anything, what it might be for the book, or it might be for the magazine, then definitely get in touch. leo@ruickbie.com.
Very important, and I think that's very much a way forward in the future. So if you are interested in this, and what we will need to do, Leo, is to get you back for a full 3-hour show sometime in the future, because I know we just scratched the surface. And Sarah and I have discussed the idea of trying to get together probably a long weekend conference down in her wonderful location down on the south coast in Hastings, to have an event maybe this time next year. And it would be wonderful if we could invite you along to join us on this one, because we've got some quite interesting people involved there. Right, everybody, just to let you know, the next show will be coming up will be on Wednesday the 12th of May at 4 p.m. when Sarah, myself, and 2 previous guests of this show, Emma McLuhan and Samantha Lee Treasure, will be joining us to have a wide-ranging discussion on the wonderful person that was Lewis Carroll, and also the writings of Lewis Carroll. And it's going to be particularly interesting because we're going to be joined by June Lawney, who is, I think, past president or somebody very senior within the Lewis Carroll Society. And also Emma will be joining us, Emma McLuhan from Northern Ireland. And Emma is doing research and planning a book on Lewis Carroll. So this could be really an interesting show. So don't miss this one. It's going to be 2.5 hours and it's going to be a fascinating chat. Then on Monday, the 17th of May, the next guest on Incon will be Graham Nichols, who I've interviewed on a few occasions before. We'll be discussing his fascinating research on out-of-body experiences. And then on Wednesday, the 19th of May, we'll be joined by Dr. Andrew Gallimore from Japan, who will be telling us about his research into entities and dimethyltryptamine. And again, some of you guys may be interested to know both Dr. Gallimore and myself will both be speakers and presenters at this year's Contact in the Desert, which will be online, and together with Samantha Lee Treasure as well, who's also going to be speaking at that event now as well. So we've got a lot on at the moment, so it's going to be quite exciting for all of you guys. We've got a lot of guests, and we've got guests queuing up to be on the show at the moment, which is really wonderful. So again, thanks very much, Leo, for your time. It's been wonderful chatting to you, and as always, thank you very much, Sarah, because without your assistance, I couldn't make this happen. So everybody, thanks you again. This will be posted on my YouTube channel later on tonight or early tomorrow, so you can watch it, and it's available for free, and it will be up there permanently, together with looking at some earlier shows, particularly the things that Leo was talking about today. If you take into account what we discussed with Stephen Browday and also what we discussed with Nick Kyle as well. They very much work as a trilogy. There's some very interesting information. If you listen to all three, there's going to be some very interesting themes there. Okay, Leo, thank you very much. And see you both and see everybody else soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.